we are back. Very short break, and we are super excited for this session that we are about to go live. Perfect. We are now live. So now I think that Mr. Maimane should be a presenter as well. Should be able to speak with us as well. I still do not see him. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you okay.
Wonderful.
Amazing.
We can't see your webcam. Maybe it's a connection problem. But at least you are here with us.
It said something like, I need to share my video, so that's what I'm trying to do. There you go. All right.
Wonderful.
Hi.
Hi,
Oh,
welcome.
super. Hey, how are you guys doing?
It's hour 13 of the marathon, so we are psyched to be having this conversation with you. Had slightly too many coffees, but I'm really excited for this session. How about you?
No, I'm good. It's my great privilege to be with you, and really looking forward to the conversation. I think it's certainly been able to catch the last little bit, and looking forward to talking about Africa and South Africa. So it's really great.
Thank you so much. So just to set the scene before jumping directly into the conversation, this session is, as usual, both streamed here on our platform and on Facebook, where they are the bulk of our followers, and is about South Africa, and in particular, South Africa's remarkable path, as we call it in the title, a model for a more democratic and united world. So we're going to discuss, obviously starting for the impressive background of our speakers, which now I'm going to introduce. We're going to discuss democracy and the path that South Africa has undergone in the last 2-3 decades to become the democracies today, and then move beyond that and think whether South Africa and its model of bringing different and diverse groups together in a real democracy can be of inspiration for the rest of the world and for the many struggle for freedoms we are observing today. So just a last word before leaving the floor to Colombe to ask the first questions. Mr. Maimane, and correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name, sorry for that, is a very inspirational leader for South Africa. He is currently the chief activist of One South Africa for All, the recent civic movement that he launched, well before he has been for many years the leader of the opposition party, the main opposition party, both in the National Assembly and in the political landscape in general in South Africa. So very, very experienced and inspirational leader. We are glad to have you with us. And having said that, let's jump straight to it. I will take the first question.
First of all, are we pronouncing correctly your name?
Yeah, Mmusi is easier.
Mmusi is easier, yeah.
And
yeah.
We'll do that. My name is Colombe.
And I'm Andrea, sorry.
Let's go back to
14 hours in, we have been like
shaky.
Doing our best.
I can imagine. These are important conversations. But thank you for doing it. Thank you for doing it on behalf of those who love freedom all over the world. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So referencing back to your incredible political career, I would start with a very simple question. Can you tell us a bit about your story? How did you manage to navigate so successfully a complex political landscape like South Africa, and especially with a unifying message like the one South Africa for All, the brand that you brought forward for many years? We would be very interested to hear from you about your experience.
Sure, and thank you so much. Let me firstly, place South Africa in context. I come from the small community called Soweto, where President Nelson Mandela resided for much of his adult life, and in much of that story, you don't have a choice. Politics becomes very interested in you when you grow up, literally walking distance from such a global icon. You become inspired to believe in the art of possibility. And so as a child, our politics were shaped by the history of our country, in the sense that it was told that as a Black South African, I needed to live in one place and white people needed to live in another. But we always knew that the evil wasn't in the person, the evil was in the system. And so in answer to your question, I grew up always with a sense of justice, with a sense of wanting to build that non-racial society. And so as an outcome of that, when 1994, which was when South Africa achieved its own liberation and its first democratic vote, it became normal to vote for, I didn't get to vote because I was too young, but became normal to affirm the fact that President Nelson Mandela would become the president of the Republic, which began the journey. And I've drawn inspiration from his leadership, and I've drawn inspiration from those who understood that it's possible for black and white to work and live together. So in terms of navigating a very complex space, you have to believe that it is possible. You have to ultimately live and pay the price for it. It doesn't say it's easy, because when you've lived in such a divided society, the hopes of one race can become the fears of another race. Because, for example, if there's hope for one race to say it must get land back as an argument, as another race feels like that land has been taken from it. Sometimes equality can feel like oppression to another. So you had to begin the journey of navigating through that. And I've been grateful for the opportunities I've had. I've been grateful for even my own family. I come from a mixed family. My wife is a white South African, and we've had to model that even for our children, to teach them that it is possible. So it's been an incredible privilege to be able to lead in South Africa and to serve the people of South Africa. And even now, working towards a movement that seeks to say one South Africa for all is not just a statement of aspiration, but truly an economic statement, a philosophical position that says all of us can do it, and an ambition to say this is a dream that Nelson Mandela bequeathed to us, and it's incumbent upon us as the next generation to take the journey forward.
You know, you just said that it's not one South Africa forward. It's not just an inspirational statement or an inspirational quote, but something that can be very practical. But you also said that there are tensions, obviously, between races, and you talked about land and giving back land that was taken and so on. How do you manage those two tensions? And I'm asking not only for South Africa, but because we are working as part of a global movement with countries, with a complicated history. So I'm French, and we're working with countries that France has colonialized and stolen from. And saying one world to the same extent is what I believe is a very inspirational model, but it can also be very hard to put into practice when you come from a complicated history like reality is. So how do you manage to deal with those practical tensions?
At first, citizens are always inspired by a shared vision. All of us have common interests. The majority of people sit in the middle. They sit in the middle where they believe fundamentally that they can work together. And I think when you want to occupy the center of politics with an articulated vision of an inclusive economy that works for all people, with an articulated vision that says that you've got to do the appropriate reforms in the economy. So you talk about land as an issue, to say that justice must be a driving factor. And it's innate within every human being to build justice, to want to see justice, because if they don't want to see it in others, there's always a temptation to know that that same could happen to them. So there's innate in every human being a sense of justice and a sense of hope. And leadership is about articulating that shared vision that is built on the axes of both a degree of justice and, secondly, a sense of hope. So you have to build that in the first place. The second aspect is, what are the practical things that actually address that were left unaddressed? Apartheid meant for many black South Africans, their education was poor. It meant that for many of them had to be left out of economic inclusion. And so you have to work harder at saying you must address that issue head on as a function of a racial injustice. So when I say you want to build one South Africa, it's in some ways an antidote to the question that sits that actually there is a South Africa for the wealthy, a South Africa for the poor, a South Africa that is black, a South Africa that is white, a South Africa that is urban, and a South Africa that is rural. But all of those must be shared objectives of citizens to say, can they build together towards one common place? So for the purposes of Africa, this has become a very important question. As I've traveled all across, in other nations, it becomes a tribal war where you can have a distinction of, one tribe versus another. I know in Nigeria, this question becomes a faith-based war where you can have a war between Muslim and Christian. When you go to Cameroon, it can become fairly English versus French, those kinds of divisions. But I think it is incumbent upon leadership to be able to say, how do you articulate a shared vision? What are the non-negotiables that all citizens must work towards, and then build towards them? And you know what? Because it's often seen as a fairly strong compromise, it does come with some challenges. It does come with the fact that not everyone is going to be happy all the time. Because sometimes people feel like they've lost the sense of them own selves. But so long as you as the leader can become the anchoring position that helps people say, so long as you're around, you're heading in a direction we can follow with. And I think what the global society is missing at the moment is what I call, it's the missing adults, right? It's the leaders who stand up together and say, this is the vision of the world as we'd like to have it. And this is how we need to lead societies towards that way. Once those adults disappear, you end up with a missing center of politics and severe polarization, which delivers leaders that become populists and find very simple solutions to very complicated, intricate problems.
Thank you so much for elaborating so much on this question. I mean, really, like you struck a very good chord, because I think they're all of us following. We have people now from Asia, from Europe, from South America. We have experienced this feeling of not having adults in the room for now a few years, and it's so inspiring to see, to hear in you as a seasoned politician and now an activist, hearing that you share this message and you can actually maybe guide people to get back on the right track. And before moving beyond and asking you more about South Africa and the world, I have another personal question for you that comes a bit, I think, out of what you just said. I mean, you were a full politician, let's say a full-blown politician. It's a good way to describe it. And now you move into activism. How come? Tell us about this path, because it's something that many of us have also experienced. It's a fine line between the two fields, and I would like to hear about your experience in this sense.
I think South Africa, like many nations in the world, politics has become an elite project. Some of it driven by the fact that politics requires a significant amount of resourcing, a ton of money. Secondly, that politicians tend to get elected by people who they tend to stop serving in a party-led system. They become servants of the party rather than servants of the people. I think thirdly, which is a serious dynamic, is that we are now living in a world, I would argue, that has become more and more not post-ideological, but is facing a resurgence of an ideological contestation in a different manner. As the world is becoming globalized and models are being imported from all over the world, it would feel that nations who are triumphant and are doing well tend to have an in-club of winners and people become losers on the outside. And so when I served in Parliament and I enjoyed the role and worked hard at advocating for people, it became more and more that politics had become a club of insiders and winners who progressively wanted to create policies that were at points self-serving and a presumption that voters do not know what they need. And I'm seeing the sense of democratic practice where, as protests are rising all over the world, politicians are finding themselves more and more not only isolated, but insulated from the cries of the people. Because as the project becomes elite, you don't live in the same communities as citizens. You don't, some politicians don't even know how much a loaf of bread costs, which is a standard item for many people. So the drive towards activism has to come back with a genuine response. On whose behalf are you fighting? I always ask anybody in the world, it doesn't matter whether you're a president or you're the leader of anything, on whose behalf are you fighting? If it's for your own jacket, then invariably you become a careerist, which is what's happened to politicians. If it is for the citizens with which you serve, then naturally you start to realize that it is important for you to get back to really engaging citizens on the ground so that you lead not out of connections or out of political ideology, but truly out of conviction, out of a sense of you are with the people, and it is the people who will in fact keep you grounded to their needs. So I've had to get back to that. I've had to get back to untangling myself from the sense of political rhetoric and the sense of, so in many ways, I always say to people, I'm a recovering politician.
You won't know this, but what you just said resonates extremely well, because both Andrea and I created in the past a pan-European political party where we elected a co-founder to it. We did politics across 28 European countries, and we describe a new life exactly with the words you just said. I mean, you did it in a more eloquent way than I could do, but it's exactly the same feeling of recovering politician and, you know, this grasp of reality. And it's something in French politics that I see at every presidential election, the question of, but how much does bread cost?
It's always,
and no one can answer, which is really, really basic. It means that you literally have never spoken to any of your constituents, lived their lives, or gone shopping for yourself, which is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
No, completely. And in South Africa, where corruption has become so pervasive, you can understand that almost the system, because it has the ecosystem of money, political parties, politicians, big business, that ecosystem tends to be self-serving, and the natural consequence of it is always invariably corruption, because there's now a privatization of state resources for the benefit of a few. And you see it happen and happen even in the US. I think in many ways, if you look at the US elite system, you kind of feel as though whilst citizens are having one conversation, it feels like the political parties and elites are having a different one. And the net consequence of it is, once that middle disappears, citizens don't feel led, they don't feel activated, they don't feel represented, and you end up with nations that potentially become ungovernable.
Jumping back before moving back to South Africa and global democracy, on two things you mentioned. You mentioned party politics and a globalized world. So you mentioned how party politics are often unable to resolve some of the major issues that citizens are facing, or to actually, you know, lead to good results for people, not just for power. And then you mentioned that in addition, we live in an increasingly globalized world where everything happens in a connected manner. How we have a third leg to this assumption now, which is that a lot of the challenges we face in our everyday lives are global, or at least are transnational, going beyond borders. If you look at climate change, it doesn't stop in London right now at the borders of the UK or in South Africa. If you look at democracy, a country's authoritarianism has impacts abroad. So China's authoritarianism in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and with the Belt and Road Initiative in Europe and in parts of Africa, has impacts on the democratic structures. How would you say that we can, across the world, you know, move beyond? And I'm asking this because of your slogan, One Africa, One South Africa for All. How do you say we could move beyond the differences we have across borders, across cultures, across religions, across races, to be able to unite and fight together those global change, to be able to really put together a global front?
Yeah, and I think what we've got to identify are the things that affect all of us. You know, I mean, no one can deny that climate and the impact of climate change is a global phenomena that I think, whether through, I must be honest, I think institutions that are established to do this particular work in certain instances have failed. When I think about the role of the United Nations, I think that in many instances, certainly speaking as an African, there have been instances of abuse of climate agreements that have not been stuck to. So I think some of these institutions have failed profoundly. And I do think in many ways that what is required is, as a new generation of leaders enter the political fray, a reorganization of geopolitics needs to come on board that is able to say, here are the things we agree on. Let's agree on climate. Let's agree on the fact that no one should ever go to bed hungry. The eradication of poverty. Let's agree that everyone's rights must be sustainable, that in fact every human being is owed dignity and rights. And let's be able to create common funding models that ensure that those rights are given effect to. And I think as a generation of young leaders who are coming on board, these objectives need to be at the forefront. Because you are correct. Some of these issues do not stop at the door. And leaders who become populist want to make us all believe that. They want to say, in the question of immigration, that the moment you have citizens from different parts of the world come into your country, then suddenly jobs disappear and all of that kind of nonsense. Again, I cannot reiterate enough. When the adults leave the room, populists arise. So I think it's not just looking at the UN developmental goals, but it's also looking at the points of common consensus and say, how does the next generation of leaders advance them collectively over the world so that nations continue to be functional in a way that we can achieve shared objectives? Because I think when we do that, what COVID, this period we've lived in now, COVID has become a global phenomena that's put us all on the same boat.
Yeah.
Yes, it's got unique iterances in different countries, but no one can deny the fact that unless we think in a globalized manner, we're going to have a problem even with small basic things like which nations get vaccines first and which ones don't. How does a continent like Africa respond to its own pharmaceutical needs becomes an important question. So to me, I think we've got to sit down and say, given some developmental goals, given some leadership challenges and failures of institutions, how do we reorganize those to make sure that there's actually a functional way forward? But one of the things I'm desperately missing in the world are conversations amongst the next generation of leaders. I think, the protest that is taking place in Hong Kong in a globalized universe has got as much of a significance to what happens here. No one can deny the fact that a protest like Black Lives Matter is a global phenomenon. South Africans identify with a similar pain that is happening in the US in that regard. So I do think there must be a cohort of leaders who are networked all over the world to discuss some of the challenges going forward and are willing to listen, particularly a cohort not of politicians, but of activists. Because I think half of the protests we're experiencing in the world is because people just don't feel listened to anymore.
I mean, I'm a bit speechless because the messages they are giving are very in line with a lot of the battles and struggles we advance. I mean, when you mentioned COVID, we recently launched a campaign to ensure that countries, not only like the 7 countries that are bidding on vaccine, but all the others can get access to COVID-19 vaccines. And that was actually supported by the WHO at the end. And many of your words resound with us. So we fully agree with your reasoning. And the only thing that I want to ask you in addition is, on topics like climate, like these pandemics, it's easy to work as a shared word, as one word.
Well, easier than other topics. Yeah.
It's easier, yeah. While when we talk about, for example, struggle for freedom, so you correctly mentioned Hong Kong, this is one of the campaigns we bring forward. Obviously, there is a natural divide. There are authoritarian countries on one side, and there are democratic countries on the other, to simplify. And obviously, global political arenas like the UN or the UN Security Council are unable to really have a say on the topic because they include both actors. So, for example, something that our organization is trying to bring forward is the idea of creating a coalition of democracies, or at least an alliance that could protect freedoms where they are clearly eroded, like in Hong Kong today. What do you think about that? Do you think that is something that you can see as a positive development for the world, or you would go another way?
No, I mean, I think that's what I'm saying. The geopolitical reorganizations become necessary. But I think it cannot just only be left up to conversations. It also requires that, without countries meddling into democratic practices of other countries, but at least have high degrees of accountability. And how we can ensure that we can bring, so when you form these new coalitions, these new geopolitical arrangements, they cannot be extractive. So I can speak as an African here. One of the problems that we face that breeds the resentment that stops African countries often from wanting to collaborate with other countries is that no one can deny the history of slavery coming from the continent. So naturally, when people feel like, slaves had been taken out of Africa and there's been no necessary compensation for that sense of justice, there is a resentment that goes towards collaboration. When you feel like, even on an issue like climate, whilst it might be easier to say you can collaborate, but when you feel like other countries have industrialized at the expense of others, and now there's a climate agenda that says to other people, you can't industrialize at the same pace, there's a degree of resentment. When countries are deliberate at using debt to, certainly I know for example, when I think about China and some of the African states, there's a deep sense of mistrust there. So we not only have to deal with the policy positions about human rights and dignity, we have to deal with the financial and the institutional arrangements that underpin that. Because when we get those things right, you then almost debunk the resentment that sometimes countries and nations feel when they feel like you can't just arrive in a country, extract its resources, whether those are people or minerals, and then sit back and say we take no responsibility for the climate conditions in that country, or we take no responsibility for the democratic practices of some of the leaders who become corrupted by big companies. I know here in South Africa, we've had a few companies who've come and, the arms deal has become one of the big discussions, and there's a genuine relationship between South Africa and other European nations in the exchange of these. So I think we've got to be able to say to ourselves, if we're going, that's why I am passionate about the next generation of leaders, because the next generation of leaders who come from an activist base will have to confront the questions about saying, what is an equitable deal for the future of Africa or for the future of global collaboration, so that it doesn't give license for people who have oppressive tendencies to thrive, if I understand your question well, or it doesn't give license for other countries to walk away from deals where they feel like they are the new superpowers and therefore can dominate other vulnerable nations. It requires better partnerships. And certainly, when I think about South Africa and the European Union as an example, 60% of our trade is driven with the European Union, and therefore it becomes a more important conversation to have as to how the trade can be equitable. How do we ensure that there's market access for some African goods that eventually end up in other markets, whether those are the US or China? So these conversations must be had in an honest manner, because if we don't do that, we're going to end up in scenarios where invariably the resentment remains and the negotiations do not breed much going forward.
I mean, you just mentioned, compensations for safe practices. You mentioned unfair deals for climate, where, for example, Europe has been one of the main polluters forever, and now other countries and continents are supposed to pay the price for it, which is completely unacceptable. Looking at how do we move from this? So we should have honest conversations between young leaders should be having honest conversations. But do you think that the model that was used in South Africa with, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission should be something that should be put in place on a global level to be able to, I mean, there's no way to enforce it, but at least have those conversations, at least acknowledge for many countries that still haven't, the harm that has been done, and try to move to find ways to compensate, to apologize as this?
That is undeniable, and that we can have that conversation is absolutely vital. But I think the value in the conversation, like the value was here in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was transparency. I think sometimes, someone said it best when they said, if there is no common understanding of the problem, then there shall be no common understanding of the solution. And I think sometimes we need to be able to sit and in transparent manners be able to say, here's what the fundamental challenges that we're trying to deal with and what we're trying to address. So if we can get a common understanding of all of those things, then it becomes absolutely crucial that whatever solutions we find going forward will be able to help. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in South Africa was very helpful in that regard. But where others are starting again to say, perhaps maybe we needed much more than that, is because if you don't subsequent to that build a leadership that is then able to then drive the reconciliation forward, rather than just simply a question of, okay, we've stopped at conversation, but actually, what is the economic program here? What is the inclusive model? What is the restitution process that must take place? And how do you ensure that what injustices were committed are dealt with? If you don't have that second part, you can nullify the first. So I do think there's a degree of accountability in terms of saying, here's what the outcomes are going to be, and here's what the long run is. And this requires a question also of activists. You know, I think sometimes people can protest and have a manifesto for wanting to have change, but often when they have to implement that change, don't always fulfill it, which raises the temperature in other areas. So I would urgently say that accountability and regularizing of that accountability then becomes important to create a charter that says, how do we respond to these issues? So what I'd like to see happen is that hopefully with the right generation of leaders, for them to be able to have a charter about these are the outstanding conversation, these are the things that we must have, and these are the actions that we're going to take on board, so that citizens understand that there's mutual benefit and there's a better sense of going forward. If you don't do that, then like we've learning here in South Africa, you can quickly create a vision of the rainbow nation, and then it's only a number of years down the line where people say, but I don't see myself in that rainbow nation, so I'm going to pull away from it.
Thank you so much for this. I think that you really detailed once more a lot of our feelings. And I want to pick on two comments from the chat. We received many comments. First of all, is that apparently our Facebook feed is going completely crazy for you. Our members are very, very enthusiastic about this conversation. So thank you so much once more for joining. And the second one is a very precise question. I think that is a good case example of what we are discussing. It also marries very well with the conversation we had throughout the day with some speakers from Palestine. And so one of our members on Facebook has asked, there is a state of Palestine, of apartheid in Israeli today, and it's easy to draw comparison with the South Africa's past. What do you think of this? Is this a case where maybe the young generation can try to go through a process as South Africa did, and maybe the global community can support?
Yeah, I mean, I always think that it's possible, given the right leadership, to be able to find solutions that work for all citizens. So long as you understand, if you like, what are the big issues and what are some of the minor issues. Because I think sometimes we merge everything together. So if I think about the Israel-Palestine conflict that is taking place at the moment, we need to agree on what some of the big issues. And the one big issue that sits there that is, for me, absolutely fundamental to be resolved is that actually the starting point should not be to address negotiating points between Palestine and Israel, but the entire region in and of itself is under stress. So the entire geopolitical reason must be resolved. We must be able to deal with what's happening in Iran and Iraq. We must be able to deal with that broader conversation as it aligns with the politics of Egypt, as it aligns with the politics of Lebanon, as it aligns, because in that broad region, you can ultimately then end up resolving, or at least having a better conversation about how it must be dealt with between Israel and Palestine. So that's a big issue that requires broader leadership. I think that to just simply reduce it to those two member states, I think is a problem. And perhaps maybe you might see my leanings by describing them as two member states, because I do think a two-state solution is an opportunity there, and it requires a way upon which, as we've learned in South Africa, that it's better to sit around the table and create a common consensus between the two countries so that they can work out how not only do they engage the broader region, but amongst themselves. What are the outstanding issues about investments, safety, territory, leadership? These matters can around the same table be discussed. And having engaged both sides of the conversation, I had an interesting conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu, met some of the leaders from the Palestinian Authority. I do think there is a way upon which this matter can be resolved, but it's not going to be independent of a solution that must be found in the broader region as it pertains to Arab, to the rest of the region in its entirety. So I think that conversation must be had in parallel so that we can deal with where we go.
Thank you so much for this articulated answer. I think that it's you're right. Like, you can't solve a problem such as Israel and Palestine, or a situation like such as Israel and Palestine, if you don't in the context of the whole region and the history behind it.
I would have a beg to differ on one point, which is that we had quite a few talks with Palestinian human rights defenders before, and I do see the point that when an entire people is denied their basic rights, when a democracy doesn't count the votes of 21% of its population, there needs to be an urgent address to this before. I don't know if it's before. If everything could happen at the same time, it would be absolutely amazing. But considering the current status, that there needs to be that Palestinian human rights need to be addressed fairly urgently as well.
No, I mean, that you cannot deny. And I think that where there are human rights violations, everyone must be held accountable. I'll give you one practical example. Here in Africa, we had a situation with a small country in the Gambia. And the East African region got together. The leader there was simply refusing to vacate office. And the East African region said, we'll act as a collective to ensure the democratic outcome. It didn't pick a side. It just simply said, here is the outcome that is required. And I think it's also incumbent upon the region collectively to be able to hold everybody there accountable if we're going to find the upholding of human rights, so that any member state that violates that, it's not only a function of the UN Security Council, but also a function of what the member states and the surrounding geographic area does in that regard, to make sure that accountability is felt across all sides.
And yeah, I also really agree with this. Just to conclude, maybe with one last question that is not directly linked to what we discussed, but Omar asked a bit earlier, I'm reading it at the same time, how South Africa is one of the most advanced countries on LGBTIQ plus rights in Africa, and how to advance LGBT rights in general throughout Africa based on the South African model.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm grateful for in South Africa is the constitutional framework and having a constitution that's highly progressive. But the independence of the Constitutional Court as a standing body isn't always as well practiced in other African countries. So we've got 3 levels of courts. We've got obviously the high courts in each of the states. You've then got the Supreme Court of Appeal, which deals with matters that come from the High Court. And then uniquely built is the Constitutional Court, which upholds the rights of everybody. Now, that isn't always the case in other nations. For example, when I think about other African states, that isn't always the case. And I would urge that that's the first and most crucial institution, to make sure that as you've given constitutional rights to all citizens, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever their religious belief is, that actually those constitutional rights are upheld. And it so happens in South Africa, we've got an interesting case in that you've got a very strong Christian Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court who upholds a very liberal constitution that makes it possible for LGBT rights to be upheld, which I think is the power of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. The second thing is, how do we equally so have other institutions derived from the Constitution that uphold it? So South Africa has got a Human Rights Commission. It's got It's got bodies that can police the violation of these rights and sanctions that go with it. So I think in part we haven't perfected it because discrimination sometimes does occur, but I do think those institutions have functioned well. They give you the framework to deal with the big issues when they occur, and they make sure that when there are smaller incidents among citizens, they treat it in the appropriate manner. So as part of the model, when I look at other African states, these are some of the institutions that are missing, and the net consequence of it is that the rights are then swept away because there are institutions that safeguard those. But
very clear. Yeah, very clear. Thank you so much. I think that we are almost out of time, and so I would like to dedicate these last minutes to give you really a platform to send a message. The whole day for us has been about how global struggles for freedoms can be dealt with together, how can activists and young people with passion can combine their efforts for a better future with intervention from every continent of this planet, with thousands of people participating from every continent. And I think this is almost the final bit of the marathon. After that is going to be more problem solving among members. And as a speaker that has been so in line actually with all our campaigns and values, and we're very grateful for that. I would like to maybe invest 3 minutes to tell our very young audience what can they do concretely to advance this dream of a more global society, but not in a sense of a globalized capitalistic economic model, but more about people coming together and working together for a better future.
So I lost you for 2 seconds. I hope there wasn't a disruption there. But firstly, one of the mantras I've lived my life by is you can make a noise or you can make a difference. Sometimes you need to make a noise to make a difference, but generally you must prefer to make a difference. I think it is upon our generation to think harder about what sort of world we want to see, to think harder about the excluded, because the profound effects that we face in the world impact those who are left out more than those who are on the inside. And by that, we must recognize that we are now returning much stronger to a world upon which we have to fight still against any abuses of power for the benefit of those who are left out. And what I would like to urge, and perhaps this is part of a resolution, is that because we live in a post-COVID universe, or will be soon, where our connections can become quickly global, we really have an opportunity to not have this discussion every so often, but to have it regularly. That it is possible for leaders from different parts of the world to be able to form a working group of leadership that is constantly finding better solutions that can be shared, so that the advocacy that takes place in the world is much more informed. We cannot define a degree of activism by what we oppose and fail to articulate what we are for. And when we can better articulate that, having shared experiences and support from all over the world, we can genuinely make an impact for future generations. And therefore, my urgency, certainly coming out of here, is that there needs to be a globalized movement with leadership that is represented in each member country, that is then able to, on a regular basis, be able to share inputs so that you can mobilize society. No one can deny that technology has connected us better. No one can deny that Twitter, social media, all of those are very helpful tools of trade. But what it will do, it will force a far more mature level of activism. It will give practical solutions to real global problems, and will give a voice to those who are left out. There are many countries that are perhaps maybe not represented in the world. How do we ensure that those voices are heard? How do I make sure that the stories of those in Pakistan and different parts are heard in more broader context? And in other parts where there seems to be, in Darfur, where some of the democratic practices have been lost. We need to bring those into the center of the conversation, make it possible, and where we can agree on at least 4 or 5 areas, whether it be the environment, whether it be education, an inclusive economy, accountability of leadership, a sense of digitizing the world so that no one is left out. And as other authors have done, how do we shift people along the developmental curve? It is upon this next generation of leaders to be able to respond to those questions. Because I do think our conversations, even around race or around discrimination, are far less toxic than perhaps what our parents bequeathed to us and what generations before us have. We can be that generation of citizens, global citizens, who can be able to say that beyond politics, beyond religion, beyond sexual orientation, we can do something together. And to plagiarize a line from President Obama is perhaps maybe to say, we are the ones we've been waiting for. So I genuinely believe that it is possible. And I'd like to see that this conversation, this marathon, doesn't become something that becomes forgotten, but becomes a network of people, so that when someone is sitting in Zimbabwe and human rights are being violated, they can pick up the phone and say, our fellow Democrats or fellow freedom lovers in France, in Poland, and wherever, stand together united to be able to attend to those. And I think then political leaders will realize the power of collective global movements, rather than just simply knowing that they're dependent on the oppression of citizens in their country. So it is well within us. So if I've used up my 3 minutes, all I'll say is that be part of a global movement. Let's establish it and let's make it happen.
I mean, you use it way better than any expectation. Thank you so much. Really, it's been a great honor to be in this conversation. I think you inspired us all after 14 hours of video conference and all the hundreds of activists that are following this stream. I think that your words will resonate with us for a long time. And I hope this can be the beginning of a collaboration on many other topics, because I really found so much commonality with the speaker. And I know you are doing great things in South Africa. We are trying our best in other regions of the world. Maybe we can work together.
Hopefully.
Absolutely. And I will see you next hopefully in your home country when everything becomes open. But hopefully we'll see you soon. As I say, I'm really open and I'm being serious. I think if we can do it, we must do it.
So let's do it.
Merci beaucoup, as they say.
Have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.